Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They're commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. President Donald Trump's election victory on November 5th has the potential for historians in the future to describe it as an epochal event in American history. The American people gave Trump a clear and unquestioned mandate with almost 51% of the vote. He received over 73 million votes, more than 4 million more than his opponent. Trump's win was fundamentally about a new American coalition, a coalition of traditional Republican voters, united with lower middle class, working class, African Americans, Hispanics, and white women, providing the monumental victory. According to the exit polls, a whopping 72% of Americans believe that their country was simply on the wrong path. Under Trump, the new path of the nation is clear, as it is for any ship embarking on a new journey. The ship of America must be sounded, the damage repaired, and a renewed course, like the ones originally charted by the celestial constellations that guided George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and most recently Ronald Reagan. It must be said, they also followed uncharted waters that had profound and lasting impact on our republic. If we stay true to our constitutional principles, America will once again have fair wind and following seas as it returns to its political, ideological principles and traditions. That course opens the door to the best years in American history. At the core of the new direction is a fundamentally different path than we've been on regarding tariffs, trade, taxation, regulations, and equity versus debt funding. As such, I'd like to cover the subjects outlined here. Before I get into the elements of the change that lie ahead, we need to first understand the position America is in and how we arrived at it. With that in mind, we'll be able to better understand the importance of the elements of the new path and what is at the core of the strategy for it. We have an issue of globalists versus we the people, or decentralized power. I've written numerous times about the concerns with globalization, financialization, and mercantilism. Though they all brought with them powerful global economic growth, they've also begun to destabilize the global economic system in different ways. From a positive standpoint, we got economic growth. Globalization brought us labor arbitrage, financialization, investment in low rates, and mercantilism, broadening of trade. The negatives that have created instability is globalization has created wealth disparity, financialization has led to a lack of price discovery and mispricing of risk, and mercantilism has led to major trade and fiscal imbalances. These are all major discussions, but what is needed is to put them in the context of the growing global geopolitical conflict they have created. We now have the developed economies of the West in conflict on multiple fronts with the emerging economies of the East as the world shifts from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. We have a conflict at the most basic level of how we choose to be governed. On the one hand, we have systems like those of the former USSR and China governed by a single-party system, built on the tenets of socialism and communism. On the other hand, we built the West on democracy and multi-party alternatives. In the latter, the new power rests with people, in the former with the controlling party. The result is centralized power, the party, or decentralized power, the electorate. The top-down exercise of power, or the bottom-up exercise of power. History as well as nature has shown that the flaw in one over the other is the failure to rapidly and effectively react to change. Change is the reality that nature has long understood to be adapt or die. Centralized power continuously fails this test, resulting in bureaucracies, economic stagnation, and falling standards of living. Sound familiar? We face that problem today in the West as governments have become increasingly excessive in size, scope of power, and percent of the economy. The result is the same as those systems that have failed: bureaucracies, economic stagnation, and falling standards of living. The recent U.S. election was very much reflective of this problem, as the red wave indicated that 74 million people felt completely disenfranchised from the American dream and barely able to survive inflation, shrinking real disposable income, and a falling standard of living. Core, the problem is the new form of mercantilism that has evolved. Mercantilism has been around in various forms since trade began to cross borders. It has taken many evolving forms, the most current form having taken shape during the 80s with trade between Japan and the U.S. It developed further as the Asian tigers increasingly encroached on Japan's trade with the U.S., and then again as China entered the World Trade Organization in 2002 and U.S. trade deficits simply exploded. The approach was simple enough in how it benefited both sides of the trade. Using China example, the elements consisted of China would ship goods to the U.S. at a landed price cheaper than could be matched by the U.S. manufacturers due primarily to wage differentials, or what is referred to as labor arbitrage, and regulatory costs. The U.S. would pay in U.S. dollars, which China would dominantly hold as currency reserves to restrict the full value of the dollar being taken as profit. China would hold the U.S. dollars in the form of U.S. Treasury debt. The massive buying of U.S. Treasury debt drove U.S. borrowing rates down and the value of the U.S. dollar higher. Low rates and a strong dollar allowed the U.S. consumer to view and purchase Chinese goods as cheap and affordable, thereby increasing U.S. consumption. The U.S. GDP grew as the U.S. became a 70% consumption economy while experiencing an increasing standard of living and low inflation. Effectively, the U.S. was exporting inflation via the U.S. dollar and growth of the euro dollar. The result was exploding U.S. trade and fiscal deficits, however, as the U.S. consumed more than it produced at the same time as China became richer as a nation state. It was a clever plan, benefiting globalization and financialization and global corporations. It also benefited corporations and governments. Corporations plus government equals consumer consumption plus taxation, with the rich and corporations paying more taxes and campaign contributions. Consumer corporations from Walmart to Amazon to Best Buy all grew profits dramatically. Meanwhile, the U.S. consumer and U.S. government grew debt, and U.S. high-paying jobs steadily disappeared. The face of America changed as it became a franchise distribution center basically for foreign-built products. The reason the U.S. consumer has become so materialistic is because of the key pillars underneath this. A social net that allows it, which countries like China don't have, so people must save for retirement, layoffs, medical crisis, etc. A cultural materialism that sustains it, and a media and political class that lives off it. The hidden elixir in the equation was that China additionally subsidized through government bank financing and special treatment for their state-owned enterprises, or SOEs. This is what is called dumping, when you have unfair trade practices involved. What we have now is Trump believes is a trump card. President-elect Trump realizes the problem is existential, and if continued will lead to a U.S. debt crisis, financial ruin, and the end of the U.S. as we know it today. He sees the solution is centered on the realization that China and the world can't actually survive without the U.S. consumer. The U.S. consumer is the trump card, which must be played to reverse course, or minimally slow. Trump believes that the way to play the trump card is through tariffs, deregulation, and government right-sizing, which will pressure manufacturers to again manufacture potentially in the U.S. What exactly is the strategy here? One word, reshoring. The goal is to bring back some of the 54,000 manufacturing facilities that left the U.S. for China. Tariffs, tax incentives, deregulation, and an American funding renaissance are simply the pillars that strategy could be built on and is going to be attempted to be built on. To President-elect Trump and his advisors, tariffs are a blunt instrument of negotiations to incent reshoring, or what is also referred to as onshoring. Tariffs were an American fixture, actually, in history. Few Americans appreciate that tariffs were a key trade element from the time of Alexander Hamilton, the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, from 1789 to 1795. Tariffs were used to fund the government and protect U.S. industry. It was the primary government funding source until U.S. income tax came into existence with the ratification of the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1913. U.S. actually maintained tariffs until World War II. Post-World War II, however, brought about new institutions stemming from Bretton Woods, IMF, World Bank's creation, brought into existence as part of the post-war rebuilding efforts and to foster global trade. Tariffs were stopped to allow broader free trade. These developments were tremendous for American corporations, which then began to truly export globally. The wealth was brought back to America, and post-World War saw the greatest increase in the American standard of living. However, things began to change in the early 80s with Japan and the emergence of the new form of mercantilism. President Ronald Reagan instituted tariffs that few really realize in the early 80s to combat and stem the tidal wave of imports from Japan. After Reagan and the advent of the Asian tigers and China's entry into the World Trade Organization, tariffs became taboo as globalization, financialization, and mercantilism dominated. President-elect Trump has been extremely clear about his plans regarding tariffs. The media continues to attack this as something that will only foster inflation. Like any media narrative that serves their corporate advertisers, there is an element of truth in it, but it distorts the realities. Tariffs are bad for global corporations, but good for the American worker and family. In the longer term, they are the only hope for keeping the American dream alive. The realities of the tariffs are that about 95% of economists polled by the Kent-Clark Center for Global Markets in September agreed or strongly agreed with the statement that imposing tariffs results in a substantial portion of the tariffs being borne by consumers of the country that enacts the tariffs. In other words, tariffs deliver inflation to the U.S. consumer. They are explained as a tax on the American consumer. This is the accepted counter-argument mantra and conditioned response that defends globalism and global corporations. This argument normally squashes any form of serious thinking of using tariffs to actually fight back. In fact, inflation has been found to be relatively low, as most recently the Financial Times major expose on tariffs and taxes that are not very inflationary. Economic theory and experience tells us tariffs are not inflationary. It's correct to claim that tariff on goods will rise in price. However, the claim fails to consider how consumers and sellers of the goods will actually react to higher prices and the situation in the country itself. Once all the economic, price, and behavioral and currency impacts net out, another round of tariffs will likely prove deflationary and harmful to economic growth. The fact is that tariffs are normally absorbed by the importing country through importers. Those costs result in lower wages, lower profits, and higher inflation. However, it is only those with pricing power in the supply chain that can actually pass on those higher cost levels. With the American worker now literally tapped out, we have a different scenario at work today. A whole different behavioral response is likely, and pricing power is in jeopardy as real sales volumes after inflation are now falling. Dollar Tree, Dollar Store, and all these similar stores are now everywhere in America, and even the upper middle class are now shopping at Walmart. That directly from last week's earnings announcement from them. U.S. consumers are being forced to shop downscale to survive after a 21% cumulative inflation on food over the past 4 years and even higher rates than that on other goods and services. With the devastating damage to the American consumer already prevalent and the world dependent on the consumer, the entire supply chain will likely be forced to squeeze margins or move more operations or elements of those operations to the U.S. itself. Trump's former economic advisor, Scott Bessent, who is now being nominated for U.S. Treasury Secretary, has already been working on this. Bessent favors a T+X tariff plan that gives global firms, say, 2 years to build factories in the U.S. to avoid any sanctions, reducing most of their direct inflation impact, but getting all the capex, supply side, and trade deficit narrowing gains. Leading the pack, Samsung, think South Korean electronics and semiconductor overall, immediately said this is what they plan to do. That might mean new economic models are needed for U.S. tariffs. If economists want to model the world as it is rather than as they or their models want it to be, Trump's tariffs will initially likely still elevate prices. But if successful in fostering a reshoring renaissance, it may be the only way out of the current U.S. economic death spiral. It is no doubt a calculated gamble, but maybe the only one left on the table for a country clearly headed down a road towards a dismal and inevitable debt crisis. What Trump just announced here this week, China, Donald Trump's plan is to raise tariffs by an additional 10% on all Chinese goods coming into the United States, and he has threatened tariffs to 60% on specific Chinese goods while campaigning for the president. Canada and Mexico will be followed with Trump's inauguration, the first of many executive orders, which will impose tariffs of 25% on all product from Mexico and Canada. Promises made, promises kept. So Trump's been talking about 10% tariffs before. In multiple campaign stops, Trump floated the idea of 10% or more tariffs, which he just announced, on all goods imported into the United States, which he has not yet formally announced, which would eliminate the country's trade deficit. He also said he should have the authority to set higher tariffs on countries that have put tariffs on U.S. imports. He has threatened to impose 200% tariffs on some imported cars from Mexico, saying he is determined in particular to keep cars from Mexico from coming into the country. Trump has targeted China in particular. He proposed phasing out Chinese imports of goods such as electronics, steel, and pharmaceuticals over 4 years. He seeks to prohibit Chinese companies from owning U.S. real estate and infrastructure in the energy and tech sectors. We're going to bring the companies back, he said. We're going to lower taxes for companies that are going to make their products in the U.S., and we're going to protect those companies with strong tariffs. End of quote. He's being very clear. Trump said that a number of countries, including allies, have taken advantage of us more than others. End of quote. The Reagan economic miracle took time for those who grew through it. For those that remember, the Reagan economic miracle, which this is really similar to, took time and cost him, Reagan, his first midterm elections, but it began to work and secured his second term. What was the fiscal investment that created this miracle for Reagan? It was about the investment in the people that power the economy. He built it on two cornerstones to empower fiscal investment: reduce strangling regulations and reduce corporate and personal taxes. He famously quipped all the time that government is not the solution, but government is the problem, and he proved it. Trump did both of these in his first term, to a large degree over an anything but Trump opposing Congress that he fought basically again and impeachment continuously for 4 years, but still managed to build a very strong economy. This time he's more prepared in my assessment. What Reagan got with the supporting Congress that he had was the realization that the U.S. government had grown to the point that it was now the problem. Government control, regulations, restrictions, and taxation was simply strangling the U.S. economic engine. Reagan's understanding of the very unorthodox Lafleur curve at the time guided his thinking and Trump's. An investment is different than simply the spending of tax money. Fiscal spending is the allocation of tax money in the form of redistribution of wealth. Today, tax money and deficit spending is allocated in a fashion that it goes towards consumer consumption in the form of transfer payment. There is no investment, but rather the consumption of the money. Fiscal investment is not about redistribution, but rather allowing those who have the money to keep it and use it to produce personal wealth. Their success, let's call it personal greed, ambition, even vision, is the only proven sustainable factor to creating investment and wealth. That wealth grows taxation, increases jobs and wages. This in turn propels independence, positive sentiment, risk-taking, and consumer confidence. We go to a virtuous upward cycle from a downward economic spiral. This is not theory. It works. It's a reality of a capitalist system with a strong supporting social net. Throughout the 2024 campaign, Trump promised to curb federal regulations that he said would limit the creation of new jobs. He also has pledged to keep intact the 2017 tax cuts that he supported and signed while in office. His team has also proposed a further round of individual and corporate tax cuts beyond those initiated in his first term. Trump has pledged to reduce the corporate tax rate from 21% to 15% for companies that make their products in the United States. In a bid to win Nevada, Trump earlier this year pledged to end the taxation of tips and overtime wages to aid some service workers and waiters. He has pledged not to tax or cut Social Security benefits. Trump has also said as president he would pressure the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates, but wouldn't make any demands on the central bank. So what can we expect now? Well, a full extension of 2017 tax cuts that expire at the end of 2025 for sure, likely including restatement of some expired business investment incentives, likely some modest additional tax cuts to accommodate Trump's campaign proposals. Expect these proposals to be scaled down, however, and would only cut taxes by a few tenths of a percent of GDP, primarily focused on individual income taxes and not corporate. To fix the competitive costs that forced companies offshore to China and to reduce the growing size of the U.S. debt, the exploding nature of government regulations must be addressed in a very serious and thorough fashion. This includes reinstating all of the Trump deregulation executive orders, as well as a whole new effort and government department called DOGE, or Department of Government Efficiency. Throughout the 2024 campaign, Trump promised to curb federal regulations that he said would limit the creation of new jobs. He also has pledged to keep intact a 2017 tax cut, likely a lighter touch approach, particularly with regard to energy, financial, and labor policies. While some aspects of antitrust policy might ease slightly, expect scrutiny of the tech sector to continue, however. I've written about this and dedicated an Under the Lens video in August called The Exploding Cost of Regulations, about the seriousness of this problem. The Department of Government Efficiency is really a Manhattan project of our time, or at least that's how they're describing it. The ultimate goal of DOGE is to make its own existence obsolete by July 4th, 2026, the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. By then it is hoped that a leaner, more efficient government will be in place, one that is more responsive to the needs of the people and more in line with the vision of the founders. If successful, this reform effort will be a gift to the nation, ensuring that future generations inherit a government that is both effective and accountable. They say, and I believe them, unelected bureaucrats in the administrative state that was created through executive action are running the government, which needs to be fixed by the executive branch. That's the core issue right now. Who is running the administrative part of the government? Unelected bureaucrats. There are three parts to the DOGE plan. The first is regulatory recessions, rolling back illegitimate regulations. The most immediate and significant action DOGE will take is targeting the tens of thousands of regulations imposed by federal agencies, many of which exceed the constitutional authority granted to these agencies. It will be using Supreme Court rulings as a guide. Its immediate suspension and review of regulations, and the creating of a system to prevent reviving illegitimate regulations. The second part is in administrative reductions, streamlining federal agencies. Alongside regulatory rescissions, a drastic reduction in the size of the federal bureaucracy will be necessary. DOGE will target specific reforms to reduce the number of federal employees, streamline agency operation, and focus government efforts on its core constitutional responsibility. This means identifying minimum staff needs, cost-effective employee transitions, leverage executive authority to limit bureaucratic growth, and restoring accountability in federal agencies. The third part is cost savings, of tackling waste, fraud, and abuse that we know is just running rampant. Beyond reducing the size of government and eliminating unnecessary regulations, DOGE will focus on eliminating wasteful spending and ensuring taxpayer dollars are used efficiently. That'll involve ending unauthorized expenditures, overhauling federal procurement, and targeting the deficit and overspending. Trump 2.0 is also looking for a renaissance to repair and reprivatize and rejuvenate the economy. Allowing the private sector, rather than the government, to allocate capital is crucial to growth and its success. The U.S. must reform the Inflation Reduction Act's distortionary incentives that encourage unproductive investment, which has to be sustained by a lifetime of subsidies. Overhauling the regulatory and supervisory environment will encourage more lending and reinvigorate banks. President-elect Trump must also address government borrowing. U.S. interest expense exceeds defense budget. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has distorted Treasury markets by borrowing more than $1 trillion in more expensive shorter-term debt compared with historical norms. Terming out that debt in favor of more orthodox borrowing profile may improve longer-term interest rates and will need to be deftly handled. The only way to return to a prudent borrowing strategy without upsetting financial markets is restoring investors' faith in the economy and preserving the dollar's global role. If Trump is even mildly correct, he could unleash and tap into the animal spirits of corporate deal-making. Trump and his economic advisors are well aware that mergers and acquisition activity relative to GDP is well below trend levels, leaving room for some serious acceleration before it becomes credit negative. This is what would be involved in bringing companies back to America. Further, given the level of rates, debt funding, M&A initially might see a more gradual uptick versus strategic activity accelerating appreciably as we get closer to the end of the cutting cycle. Trump is also acutely aware that the dramatic growth in private credit has been a major theme in credit markets. The growth has been massive, but has not yet been fully tapped. This could propel an unlimited amount of investment. Currently, it has prompted talk about greater regulatory oversight and scrutiny. This is expected where Trump's team can make some strategic moves. The expected focus on deregulation in Trump's second term dampens the prospect, which bodes well for continued growth of private credit. There may be no better time to take on than now, as foreign investment is plunging there and has went negative for the first time ever since it came onto the global export scene. There may be just a chance that Trump 2.0 may pull this off. So, what can we conclude? The removal of the burden of supporting the world is a big element of this also. The U.S. can no longer financially support the world, as its foreign policy has effectively done since World War II. The U.S. has become the global piggy bank, supporting the United Nations, NATO, involved in all world crises, 600 military posts, and arms and support to Ukraine, Israel, and every other combatant in the world. Yes, it's great for the military-industrial complex, but is that the way to build $37 trillion in debt? This must end to protect the U.S. standard of living and maintain the American dream. We must see reprivatization of the U.S. economy and stop false and unproductive economic growth, stop the distortion of capital allocation, and restore faith in the U.S. dollar are critical. And in the last video, I talked about these three quite extensively. Though tariffs are paid by importers, studies show that this doesn't necessarily translate into consumer price inflation. Trump believes that the U.S. consumer is the winning trump card. Without it, China and other export-led mercantilist nations are seriously jeopardized. The Trump card is a strategic play to start a manufacturing reshoring shift back to the U.S., or at least potentially. This shift will result in jobs, tax revenues, and potentially ignite a revitalized U.S. investment and reprivatization paradigm shift. This is a big gamble, no doubt about it, by the new Trump administration, but they view the current mercantilist-driven debt path as being an existential threat to the U.S.'s survival. However, there are major hurdles ahead that the Trump 2.0 team are taking on. Inflation risks, fiscal constraints, debt ceiling, political window, all of which I've talked about many times. It is going to be a challenge, but I believe the new team that I see unfolding is up to the challenge. There's going to be tremendous resistance to it, no question. But frankly, it's the only way out of the debt spiral that we're currently in as a country that I can see. Okay, and I'm not being political here. I'm being somebody who is simply trying to make sure that the United States will foster and survive, and what we've been doing has not been even close to the solution. As I always remind you in these videos, remember, politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems, until such time as no one will take the money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They're for education and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there's actually seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following necessarily what have been the traditional and true and tried approaches. But do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2024 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. I sincerely thank you for listening.